Hello, my name is Clarence Mitchell. I was born June the 18th, 1924, on a farm close to Cairngorm, about 5 miles from Strathroy. I lived with my mother, my father, and a brother a little younger than me. I started to school out there, a country school. It was just a one-room school where they had primer right up to the end of grade 8. And the school was about 2 miles from my house. So we had to walk 2 miles to school in the morning and 2 miles home at night. And in the wintertime, if there was a lot of snow, my father would hitch up the team onto the big sleigh and put some hay on it or straw on it and go down to the corner by a Cairngorm store, and then he'd turn around and come back and he'd pick up all the kids and take them to school. But we had to walk home at night. There was a bad disease going around back then. A lot of people got it. It was called scarlet fever. And my father got it, and he got it real bad. He was real sick, but he had to go out every morning and look after the livestock in the barn and go out every night and make sure they had feed and water. And his temperature went way, way up and baked his brain. He could do nothing after that. His brain was gone. They came out from London and they took him into London to a mental hospital where he spent the next 30 years. Then the government come out and they took our land, they took our crops, they took our farm implements, they took our barn, they took our livestock, they took our house, they took our furniture, they took our clothes. My mother was given $1,000 for a wedding present from her father's will, and it was in a joint account at the Royal Bank, and they cleaned my father's bank account out, and they took that too, and kicked us off the farm. We left the farm. I can remember walking into Strathroy with him getting onto my mother's right hand. My brother Roy was toddling along on her left hand, and I was walking at the side of the road where the horses and buggies and wagons went, because all the roads back then, there was no paved roads back then. They were all gravel, and the gravel stones was hard on the horses' feet. I don't think I had any shoes on even. We didn't have no money. We had none of us, nobody had a penny. Part way to town, Arnold Linton came along with his Model T Ford car and picked us up. My mother didn't know where to tell him to take us because she thought if it rained we'd have to go under a bridge or something, but we got to town and we ended up at my Uncle Dave Bolton's, my grandmother's brother, and he took us in. Well, Uncle Dave was a World War I veteran, and he was wounded very, very badly near the Battle of Vimy Ridge, just up the beach ways. He lived in the same house he lived in before the war, before World War I. Uncle Dave, he worked at Carter's coal yard shoveling coal. Coal would come in big train cars on the train, and his job was to shovel the coal out of the train cars into the bins and into bags going into people's houses. And he got $1 a day to do that. He worked 6 days a week, so he got $6 a week. There was no mother's allowance back there. There was no way that we could get any money to live at all. So you either had to go and make a few cents or go without. A lot of people was, I guess, in the same boat as us. A lot of kids were going to bed without any supper. Well, so was we. But Roy and I used to go, we lived across from the Presbyterian church. And the people at the church had a church shed back there where people coming to church would put their horses in the church sheds. That was on Sunday, but during the week, the farmers come to town, they would put their horses in the church sheds, and if the church sheds was full, they'd tie their horses to the trees along Richmond Street and along Albert Street. And Roy and I would go over around noon hour. There was a pump in the backyard of the church, and we'd pump water, and we would water the horses. Roy'd have to stand on my back and unhook the hame strap, I think that's what you call that strap, so the horse could lower his head down. And if there was hay in the wagon or hay in the back of the buggy, we would take the hay and lay it down, and we'd feed the horses, and we'd water the horses and feed them. When the farmers came back, they found out that we watered and fed their horses, and if they were a real rich farmer doing real good, we'd maybe get 10 cents. But if they wasn't that good, well, we'd get a nickel, but it didn't matter, 5 cents or 10 cents. We'd always got something for watering and feeding the horses. Sometimes the older boys would come and they would unhit the horses on a buggy or a wagon and put them in backwards and hook them up. And the farmers didn't think much of that, but they knew it wasn't my brother Roy and me, so we'd still get our 10 cents or 5 cents. We was always doing something to get some money. If it snowed, Roy and I'd have our snow shovels out, and we'd shovel the sidewalk all the way around the block, and we'd shovel everybody's sidewalk in and shovel their porches, and we'd get 5 or 10 cents for shoveling snow. And we would cut grass just so we could get something to eat. We'd give the money to my mother just so we could get something to eat and a warm place to sleep. There used to be what we called the dead hole down behind the creamery. We didn't have town sewers or town anything back then to do away with waste. So from the creamery, any wastewater went out into this here mud hole, and it was full of turtles. And Roy and I used to go back in this old mud hole, and we'd get turtles. And we'd take the turtles, we'd have quite a few in a bag, take the turtles up to Len Wong's restaurant and sell them we'd get a turtle about this big, we'd get a nickel, we'd get 10 cents, or if it was a bigger turtle, we'd get 25 cents. So we would do pretty good catching turtles, and the Len Wong restaurant was noted for their turtle soup. And a lot of people would go there for their turtle soup. It was really good, I guess, but I never tasted it, so. And then Roy and I would go to the golf course after dark and strip off all our clothes, and we'd have a bag, and we'd swim along the bottom of the river and reach in the mud and get golf balls that the people couldn't get. And then we'd take them home, and my mother would help us, and we would clean them all up and clean them real good. And then we'd take them back the next day and sell them to the golfers. We didn't get a lot, but we might even get 35 cents for a real good one. So we'd made quite a bit of money getting golf balls out of the bottom of the river. My mother, when she went to school, she worked for Geddes' clothing store. And back then, you didn't go to a store and buy a new suit or buy a new dress. You went and you bought material, and you were measured up, and your clothes were made in the store. And my mother became a seamstress. She had an old sewing machine at home, an old Singer that she had to pump to make the thing go, I guess. People used to bring old clothes to our place, old coats and old stuff that they didn't want anymore. And my mother would never take the scissors to cut it up, but she would take the stitches all out, and she'd have all this material, and she made Roy and me suit so we could go to Sunday school. And those suits were just as good as suits that they get nowadays in a clothing store. Also, people would come to our place, and my mother would make a dress for a lady, or she'd make clothes for their kids and make a few cents. We did pretty good that way. Roy and I learned to swim in the Sydenham River down here. Back then, the water was nice and clean, and it was cool all the way from Alexander Park to Victoria Street, from Victoria Street to Albert Street, from Albert Street to the railroad bridge was all woods at that time. And there was a lot of deep holes in the river, and that's where all the town boys learned to swim. you didn't need a bathing suit. You were in the woods anyhow. So then there was a big machine came down by the Pinkham's grist mill. I guess it was across from the Presbyterian or the Catholic Church, only down about another half mile or so up the river. And they dug a great big deep hole and a big wide hole and made a swimming pool that everybody in town called the duck pond. Everybody knew the duck pond, all the kids in town. All the boys went down there and stripped off and went swimming. And then the girls decided they should go swimming too. Back then we wore bib overalls, but we cut them off and made swimsuits. And the girls would come and they'd change their swimsuits on the south side of the bushes, and the boys would change their swimsuits on the north side of the river. The duck pond, even after I grew up, the kids were still using the duck pond to swim. My mother would go over to Ernie Wright's every Sunday night. Mr. Wright had a music store uptown, and they had quite a bit of money. And Mr. Wright had 4 sons, and each one of them was very musical. And they played in bands and music dances and stuff. And they had one daughter, Mary Wright, and she was a professor in the university in London. They built a new school in Strathroy, and they call it the Mary Wright School to this day. Anyhow, my mother would go over there on Sunday night, and they'd have a big meal, and then they'd go to church. And my mother's job was to go over, wash the dishes up, put the food away, and clean the kitchen. And when they come home from church, Mr. Wright would give my mother 50 cents, which my mother looked forward to. Back in those days, 50 cents was money. And then the preacher's wife would come over from across the street and get my mother, and my mother would throw on a clean dress and go across and witness a wedding. And when she got through witness the wedding, they would give her $1, which back then was really good, just to witness a wedding, I'll tell you. Roy and I used to go up around the farmers' fields and along the roads, and we'd get lamb's quarters. Lamb's quarters was a weed, and my mother called it lamb's quarters, I guess it was. And we'd take a great big bunch home. My mother would wash it, and she would cook it, and we'd eat it for spinach, which was really good. Monday morning, she'd go down to Charlie Gill's grocery store, and she'd get the vegetables that was all wilted, that they couldn't sell, that they didn't sell on Saturday night. And she'd have a whole bunch of groceries. You could take a carrot and bend it, and it would just bend, it wouldn't snap. Then she'd go down to the butcher shop and get a soup bone. And if they didn't have a soup bone, she got a bone for a dog, which was about the same thing. And she had a big kettle about this big and about this deep on the old wood stove. And she had all these vegetables in there and this soup bone, and that's about what we lived on all week. But Roy and I, every morning we had oatmeal porridge. No milk, no sugar, just oatmeal porridge. And I used to on the way to school, stop at some of the kids going to school. Arnold hopping across the street, his mother would put a couple of little thin pancake sort of things in a bowl and pour some hot water on them. I had oatmeal porridge. So I figured I was doing really pretty good. Well, back then, you used to get free milk at school, but to have free milk, you had to pay 5 cents. And Roy and I never had 5 cents, so it was only the kids with more money that had money for the free milk. So we couldn't have free milk. Roy and I took the idea that we should join the Boy Scouts. So the Boy Scouts always met on Wednesday nights at Charlie Jervis's second-hand store. And we went in there one Wednesday night, and the Boy Scouts were all sitting around with their uniforms and everything. Ian Bateman was a scoutmaster, and he wanted to know what he could do for us two boys. Told him we thought we'd like to join the Boy Scouts. Well, do you boys have the money for the uniforms? Well, no. Well, when you boys get the money for the uniforms, You come on back. We'll be glad to have you in the Boy Scouts. So Roy and I for years and years laughed that we were too poor to have the money for the free milk and we couldn't join the Boy Scouts. Alan Parker and I was a friend of mine, and we used to swim in the water tower way up above the furniture factory. It was 100 feet from the ground. A big ladder went all the way up to the bottom of the tank, and then there was a walkway around the bottom of the tank. You had to be careful where you stepped because the boards were getting kind of rotten. Then you climbed up the side of the tank and went in a hole in the top, and then there was a little platform where we took our clothes off and jumped in. Well, that night we went over, the old watchman was sleeping at the ladder on the way up, and we thought, oh, we ain't gonna be able to go swimming tonight. I said, well, the old guy's asleep, let's just sneak in behind him and see if we can go up. So we did, and we got up to the tank all right. So we were up there, swimming around, and we heard somebody coming up the ladder. Up there, if anybody stepped on the ladder, you could hear it because sound travels quite a ways in water. And we could hear them coming up that ladder. Parker says, that old watchman's coming up. I says, no, he's too old and too fat, he'd never come up here. Well, maybe it's Two Gun. Well, back then Strathroy only had one policeman, George Tanton, and all the kids called him Two Gun. And with the kids all calling him Two Guns for a year or two, the adults got calling him Two Gun too. So the chief of police in Strathroy was called Two Guns. Well then, Two Gun, his office was in the town hall basement, and the jail was down there too. And Two Gun would park his car out in front of the town hall. Well, back then, I think this would be about 1933 maybe, automatic transmissions wasn't invented yet, but we'd put the old stick drive in neutral and we'd push his car down past the old railroad station or into Carter's coal yard or somewhere, and Chief then would go and sit on Sam Oakes' steps across the street and wait for Two Gun to come out, and he'd come out of the town hall and just wouldn't pay any attention there was anything wrong at all, wander on down the street, and then he'd come back and, you young buckers, I know it was yous, I'll get yous. But he'd have a little smile at the corner of his face. I think old Two Gun was enjoying the charade as much as we were. Anyhow, we used to play pranks on, all kinds of pranks on Chief Tanton, Two Gun. I lived across from the Presbyterian Church, halfways to Maitland School and halfways to Coburn School. So when I went to school in the morning, if they needed my seat at Maitland School, I'd end up at Coburn School, and vice versa, Coburn School to Maitland School. And I never knew when I went to school in the morning what school I was going to be coming home to at night. And you're supposed to go to school back then until you were 16. But most of the boys my age, and the girls too, was out of school more than we were in school, just making a few cents just so we could get something to eat and a warm place to sleep. I think I only got as far as grade 6 in school. My friend Parker said he did good to get that far. He didn't think he got as far as grade 6. But we did all right. We're doing okay. I guess I forgot to say that about 1929, Canada was in a big depression. Nobody had anything. Nobody had any work. The factories all just worked part-time. Nobody had any money. So it was a real hard time. It was real extra hard for these guys that lost their farms and come to town with nothing. We did have a hard time, all right. When I was in the Navy, I served on 3 shifts. I served on minesweepers, destroyers, and aircraft carriers. I was drafted off to the destroyer, and I was sent by train from Halifax to Vancouver Island to pick up a spanking new aircraft carrier. And the aircraft carrier was made in Algoma, Washington, and taken up to HMCS Naden to be modified into British standards. The aircraft carrier was commissioned for the Royal Navy of England, but it was manned by 850 of us young Canadians. And while I was looking the ship over, I ran into Ted Statham. And Ted Statham took me home to his apartment. He had an apartment there. I'd have supper there quite a bit. And then after the war, when I came home, I lived in Statham's apartments upstairs, and I'd be sitting out in the back porch, and Ted would come along and he'd say, "Get down here, the war's over. Get down here and get to work." So that's how I got started into the plumbing business. When Roy came home from the Navy, Roy and I worked together plumbing, putting in bathrooms and pressure systems and everything. And I still had my Navy hammock, and I used to hang it outside from the chimney next door to a telephone post. And Ted would come in every morning and get along like the pipe and tap my hammock. "Wake up, talkie wakey, about time to go to work." So anyhow, Roy and I, we was working at the plumbing business, and Roy and I decided that we should go into the technical school in London and get a license, go to night school. So we went in and talked to the principal. We didn't have enough education. "No, I'm sorry, you boys can't register here. You'd have to go home and get a high school education." We went home, and both Roy and I said, "To heck with it. We could go plumbing without a license. We don't need a license." But in a day or two, we got a letter from the school telling us when to report to school, because they couldn't turn us down because we were both returned servicemen. So we went to school, night school, and in a year, we showed those city slickers in there that us country hicks wasn't so damn stupid, because within a year, both Roy and I had our journeyman plumber's license. Well, Roy didn't think that's good enough, but I thought I'd go back to school for another year and get a master's license. So I went back to school to get a master's license, and I was the only one in the whole school going through for a master's license. All the other guys were just guys going through for the first license. And the teacher didn't know what to do with me, really. And they were building onto the old Victoria Hospital in London, and he was the head plumber, and it was him, he was like the foreman for the plumbing, and he would give me the blueprints, great big blueprints about this thick, and I'd figure out his next day's work for him. And got along just fine, and he'd check it, and he finally got to the stage he didn't even bother checking it because there was no mistakes. And he'd just take it, and then the teacher would get sick. He'd get the flu or something, he'd be off for over a week. So I would just take the class over and teach plumbing to the guys that's just going through for their first license. The school didn't know nothing about it, the principal didn't know nothing about it. It was just, we just did this, and nobody knew a thing that I was teaching the class for a week or so. At the end of the year, I had to go to the City Hall in London with the mayor, plumbing, and there was a couple of plumbing inspectors and a whole bunch of medical officers and people sitting at this big table. When you first went in, you had to do a blueprint. They had a blueprint with all the fixtures on it, and you had to put all the sizes of the vents, draw all the vents and the wet wastes and all the sizes and all that stuff. And then when you got that done, you had to go in to the mayor's chamber and sit at the end of the table, and the people sitting at the table just kept asking you questions, and you just kept answering them. So when you got that done, you had to go back into and finish your written exam, which I got that done, and they tell me I passed it 100%, so I got my master's license. After that, I worked for Statham's for a while. Then I decided I'd start my own business. So I did. I bought a house over here. This house came for sale. They wanted $6,000 for it, but I only had $3,000. So I seen the fellow that was selling it, and he sold it to me, but I had to go up to the lawyer. Mr. Bixel was the lawyer at the time, and he says, "You're going to have a mortgage for $3,000. I said, "Yeah, guess so." So he says he got up out of his chair and went out to the waiting room. There were some men sitting out there, and he motioned to the men, And this man come in and he says, this fella needs $3,000. He's buying the old Wright place. Okay, that's all there was to it. So I had to pay $50 a month on the mortgage, and I only made $15 a week. But I saved every cent. It was pretty tough going, but I paid my mortgage off, and people says I'd never own the place because I started plumbing here. And when I started plumbing, I think it was 75 cents an hour is all we got for labor, and I had to supply the truck and the tools and everything for 75 cents an hour. Herb Frank was the other plumber in town. Statham's were still plumbing. Herb Frank came over one day and wanted to know, he didn't think we could go up to $1 an hour. And I said, well, we can try, we can go up, but if we don't get any work, I guess we can come back down to 75 cents again. But we went up to $1 an hour. Wasn't no time at all before Statham's went up to $1 an hour. So we're all getting $1 an hour back then. This would be back in about 1959 or somewhere. The war was over in 45, and I worked for Statham's for a while and bought my own house here. And I've lived in this house now for about 70 years, I guess. I guess I still own it. So I must have been doing all right. And I raised 2 boys here and got married. After I plumbed for a while and get bathrooms and pressure systems, putting wells down, there was a furnace traveler came to my place and said there's a furnace man up in Formosa, Ontario, that was going out of business. He got hurt and hurt his back, and he's got his 8-foot brake, his lock former, his square and shears, and a bunch of tools for sale. He thinks I should maybe go up there and see if I can buy them and start putting in forced air heating systems. I said, I don't know. I don't know nothing about making ductwork. Anyhow, I went up, and I guess for $1,000 I bought an 8-foot brake, a lock former, square and shears, and a lot of tools. Come home, got myself some metal from London Metal Service, cut little pieces, and started figured out how much money or how much inches I needed to put locks on pipes and one thing and another, and I ended up making all my own ductwork from then on, except I didn't make any round pipes. I bought the round pipes, and I made all my square ductwork, and I got along just fine. My first furnace I put in for an old Navy friend of mine who was in the Navy. He was way up doing the same thing we was, and I put a furnace in his house, and I think it was just maybe 4 or 5 years ago, he had to put a new furnace in. The furnace I put in, it had only been in for about 60 years, and he told me he should get his money back because it should have been guaranteed. 60 years, I said, and he was just laughing, he was just kidding me, but that furnace was in there. I've got furnaces in the country right now that are still in. After I had my own business going here, every, I guess, January and February, things were kind of dead. So one of the fellows I worked with at Statham's, him and I would get in my old work truck, we'd throw all the tools out and put in some camping gear, and we'd go to Mexico. We'd be down in Mexico. This one here, this picture, if you wanted me to get going with this one, him and I used to just go, but a few years later, my wife used to go with me, and my mother went with me this year, and Alan Parker went with me, and a friend of his, and we used to go to San Blas every winter. It was a little thatched hut fishing village on the Pacific side of Mexico. For this picture, you'd go to San Blas, and you go back a road, and you go about 5 miles around the beach, and then you'd go up an old road up into the mountains, and this village was up there. And we got up there, we got out, we was walking up, this was the main street, and in fact, this is the main street. It was we walked past sort of a store, and the store owner seen us, and he waved us in, told us he had seats sitting on the veranda out front, and he wanted to know what we wanted to drink, were we thirsty, and he couldn't speak a word of English, we couldn't speak no Spanish. Anyhow, he brought us out Coca-Cola and Pepsi-Cola and a couple of beers. Well, I had a beer, and I think I had a Dos Equis, and we had a great visit with him. couldn't talk language, we couldn't talk to one another, but anyhow, we left there and we shook hands and had a good visit with him. And then on the way back, we was coming along this street here, and we could hear a whole bunch of kids in this building. It was a thatched hut building, and that turned out to be, that was the town school. And the teacher heard us out front, and she came out, and she just spoke a very, very few words of English, but she told us to come on in. So we went in the school with all the kids. They wanted to know where we lived, and we said we lived in Canada. Gringos. No gringos. No, we're not gringos. Further north. Canada. Soy Canadienses. Oh. Then they start shaking. We thought it was because it was cold up here. No. Oh no, the teacher says, no, you guys got moose up there. Moose. They're afraid of the moose. Big horns, moose. You got moose up there. They wouldn't come up to this country because we got moose up here. But anyhow, after the school, the teacher she just knew a few words of English. Very, very few. And we went out, and all the girls come out to get their picture taken. My wife showed them the camera, and the girls all come out, but the boys didn't come out because the boys didn't have any clothes on. They didn't bother putting clothes on to go to school up in this little town. In a lot of places they didn't. Anyhow, this little guy's got no clothes on at all. He's just maybe a beginner. Anyhow, the girls got their pictures taken, and I had a Polaroid camera, and I took their pictures and gave them a picture to take back into the school. So I imagine they still got that picture in that school. But it was that was a school, just a thatched hut building. And anyhow, other years, Bill and I would go to Mexico, and we used to go to San Blas too. We liked that because they had a motel there, and we could stay in the motel for two people for $1.20 a day, our money. Of course, it would cost maybe 20 pesos or something, their money, I don't know. But it didn't cost us hardly anything. We could stay there for nothing. Then Bill and I've been just about to every place in Mexico except Acapulco. I told my wife, after I got married, Maureen and I used to go to Mexico. And I told my wife if I wanted to see a big city, I'd go to Toronto. So to get to San Blas, we had to go down through the United States. Quite often we'd go in at Laredo, or maybe we're down at Brownsville. Then we'd go south into Monterrey, down through into Valles, Thomas and Charlie, and down to Mexico City. Then we'd come back up around, up through Morelia, Tampico, and Mazatlan, Guadalajara, and all those cities. And we'd end up at San Blas. And well, in some years we were very adventurous, so we decided we'd go to the Yucatan. Back then, they didn't have bridges over the rivers and stuff. So it didn't matter. If other trucks and cars could go, there wasn't many cars, but if they could get through, I guess we could get through. We went to Mexico City, and then we went to the west, to Veracruz, but you had to go through a place called Aroba, I think it is. And it was the hardest climb you ever seen in a mountain. In fact, when you were going up the mountain, instead of the big trucks, you were supposed to be on the right-hand side of the road, but the big trucks coming down, they'd take the outside, or take the inside. It was just a cut off of the mountain, and they didn't want to put their weight on the outside rim. We went to Veracruz, then we went to all those cities all up through on the Gulf of Mexico. We went as far as Chichen Itza. Chichen Itza is a ruin, that's where the ruins is, up there past Morelia. And yes, we had to ford the rivers, A lot of rivers we forded. There was one place where you had to put it on a couple of places we had to put it on a ferry to cross the river, but it was really, the ferry had no motors, but what they did, they had a cable across the river, and then if you wanted to go the other way, they put the bow in and the stern out, and the stream pushed you across the river. And you want to come back, they put the opposite, and the stream pushed you back across the river. That was quite amazing to us guys how that worked. Then there was another place where we had to go put on a ferry, and we had to go quite a ways. It was, I don't know, I think it was about a half an hour trip on an island. They kept motioning us to come on further, I was right up on the gate that they put down when you get to the other side. And the kids were laughing because there was a bunch of kids there that was hoping I'd plunk into the drink. Anyhow, no, we got across, and then we had to take a ferry from the other side of the island back to the mainland again. And we got all the way down there to Chichen Itza ruins. You've maybe heard tell of them. And yes, we got my picture taken, and that's where they had the cenotes, where they threw the maidens in to make it rain and all that kind of stuff. One year Bill and I was down there. We got as far as Mexico City, and well, we didn't know whether we'd go back up around by San Blas or let's go further south. Let's go down as far as the Guatemala border, see what's down that way. So we went way down there, way down to a place called Salina Cruz, way down past Oaxaca. We called it Oaxaca for a long time before we found out we were supposed to call it Oaxaca. We was way down there about 1,000 miles south of Oaxaca. Anyhow, on our way home, it was a hot day, and we were coming along on the road, and we come to a thatched hut building that had signs out, Coca-Cola and Pepsi-Cola and beer and one thing and another. I said, let's go in and have ourselves a drink. So we goes in, and we get in there, and there was a lady in there, and a bunch of kids playing in the backyard. The lady put on an apron, and she come over, and I had a beer, and Bill had a Coca-Cola, I think, or a Pepsi, I forget which. Chickens running all over, it was just a dirt floor, chickens running all over the floor, clucking, and they had round tables, about so round, chairs around them, and just maybe a half a dozen of these round tables in here. It was just a thatched roof. You could see the little lizards squishing around in through the lattice work in the building, but they never bothered you. The chickens never offered to get up on the table because I think they were all trained that they had to stay on the floor. Well, anyhow, we were sitting there enjoying our beer and just watching everything, knowing what's going on. Pretty soon there was the damnedest commotion you ever heard in your life. In comes the front door, comes a cow, and a boy with not a stitch of clothes on, about 14 or 15-year-old, driving the cows through the restaurant out into the backyard to be milked. And the waitress, she was laughing and she was doing this, that the cow was being brought in, and the cow knew where to go too, because it had been brought in lots of times into the backyard to be milked. And Bill and I thought that was funny. This kid didn't have a stitch of clothes on, and the cow coming through the restaurant. Anyhow, we enjoyed that. And I forget the names of some of this stuff. Used to be the guys that they put a pole up, way up. It was a high pole, went up there 80, 90, 100 feet, I guess. And they had a guy at the top, and the ropes was wrapped around, and they tied their feet on it and come down, and their weight would let them come down round and round, and a guy would stand at the top and do a little dance and play a little drum. And I forget what they called those guys. You ever heard tell of them? Yeah, I got pictures of them somewhere. That was interesting, watching those guys. Then Marina went to a bullfight once. It was okay to see a bullfight once. but you had to leave early because at the end of the bullfight, or quite before the end of the bullfight, people started throwing stuff where they sit, and they advised us to get out. So before the throwing started, Maureen and I got out and got in the car and took off. And we do that every winter until we got kids, and then we stayed home. I think we had Gary down there once. I think I had a house trailer, and I think we had Gary down there once. But you had to be careful. You couldn't drink the water down there. You couldn't eat a lot of the food, but you could go into a restaurant, and if you go back into the kitchen, anything that was boiling on the stove, you could eat. People were on the side of the road selling fish, selling cookies, bananas or something. You daresn't eat them, or you'd got Montezuma's Revenge, which was the turista, which was the diarrhea, and it was a bad one, and you had to have medicine to get cured, and you couldn't drink the water. You could eat a banana, you could eat oranges, anything you could peel was safe to eat down there. But when we left, we'd have a box right full of canned goods, so we pretty well ate out of our camper. At San Blas, there was a restaurant there and called the Torino, and we used to go there for supper some nights. And the people that owned the restaurant knew that we had to have stuff served real hot, or we'd get the turista. And they had plates about this, oval plates about this big, and I'm telling you, they filled them right full of food, and we used to go there for just a few cents and get our supper. And the people were good to us because they knew us, because we've been there before, and Odin and Vi Couch went with us once to Mexico. Well, they didn't. We went first, and they come down, and we were going to meet them at San Blas. Odin was one of these guys you couldn't tell nothing. People were selling corn on the cob or something at the street corners, and Odin would have to have one, and he'd eat it, and he ended up with Montezuma's Revenge, and oh God, he was sick. We finally found a drugstore and told the druggist could speak some English. He gave him some medicine, but it took about 3 days even without the medicine to cure him up. He really had it. There was a field across from the school, and when the small Piper Cubs would come in, airplanes, they'd circle around the school, and the kids would all come running out, climb over the fence, and get the animals all to one end so the guy could land. And then they'd go back into school, and the guy, he'd come out and he'd start his plane up and rev up the engine, roar, roar, roar. Kids would all come running out and get all the horses and cattle and goats and everything down to one end, and he'd take off. Then he'd fly around the school and dip his wings, thank them, and away he'd go. We found that kind of amazing, to think the kids would go out of school and get the animals off the field so they could land. But that's how they did it back then. And the boys didn't wear much clothes neither, hardly nothing, until they got about 8 or 9, 10 years old. And then they started putting something on. The girls always had a skirt on, and it was really interesting. I used to like to go to Mexico because it was so different. And the people were so friendly. Once you get past the border towns, the people were really friendly, just ordinary farmers. Lots of times we just pulled off into the desert for the night, and there wouldn't be a building or a soul you couldn't see for a long ways. You wouldn't see a darn soul. So we'd be sit out and have a little bonfire going. First thing you know, we'd have a whole bunch of people sitting around us. Where the hell did they come from? Anyhow, we'd have let on we could visit with them. We'd have quite a visit. They couldn't speak a word of English, and we couldn't speak a word of Spanish hardly, just a little bit. I could talk a little bit of Spanish, just a few words. And then we'd say, Dormir, it's time to go to bed, and they'd shake our hands, and away they'd go. Where they went, I don't know. There was no buildings. We were out in the middle of the desert. There's one place down there that they had a big volcano, I guess. It was a few miles north of Tepic, south of Mazatlan. south of Guadalajara, I guess it was. It was a valley down in there, and you were up on a little higher country, and the valley was down there, and all you could see was the church steeple. Everything was lava. The volcano had filled the whole valley full of lava, and it all got hard rock. All you could see was the church steeple. Imagine. I think I got some pictures of that somewhere, but we couldn't find them. I wouldn't know where anything is in this house.